My mother told me that if a Moretti ever recognized this necklace, I had one sentence to give him before I ran. I remembered those words at exactly 9:17 on a Thursday night, standing beneath a chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Moretti Grand Hotel, while 300 strangers applauded a painting worth more than my entire apartment building. I was not supposed to be there. My supervisor at the Brooklyn Museum had come down with the flu 6 hours before the charity auction, and I was the only assistant curator too broke to invent an excuse. So I wore the same black dress I had owned since college, polished a pair of shoes that had already been repaired twice, and crossed the East River carrying a borrowed leather portfolio as though it belonged to me. It did not. Nothing in that room belonged to me. Not the crystal glasses. Not the white orchids rising from silver vases. Not the effortless laughter of women wearing diamonds bright enough to catch the light from 50 feet away. I kept one hand near the small silver bird resting against my collarbone. Grace had fastened it around my neck on my 18th birthday. She called it a swallow, although its wings looked too small to carry anything through a storm. She died 7 years later without telling me why she had guarded it more carefully than our rent money. A voice at the front of the room announced the final auction item. The crowd quieted. I looked toward the stage and saw Adrian Moretti for the first time. He stood beside a portrait of a dark-haired woman in a blue dress, one hand resting on the auction podium. He did not look like a man who needed attention. Attention simply arranged itself around him. Conversation stopped when he lifted his eyes. Security guards watched his smallest movements. Even the auctioneer waited for his nod before speaking again. Adrian was introduced as chairman of the Moretti Foundation and the owner of half the buildings visible through the ballroom windows. None of that explained why the air changed when he looked in my direction. At first, I thought he was staring at the portfolio under my arm. Then the chandelier turned slowly above us, and a blade of light struck the silver bird at my throat. Adrian froze. His fingers loosened. The auction hammer slipped from his hand and struck the marble floor with a sharp crack that silenced the room. He did not glance down. He kept looking at me. I should have remembered Grace's warning. I should have delivered her message and found the nearest exit. Instead, I stood there while the most powerful man in Manhattan stepped away from the podium and crossed the ballroom. People moved before he reached them. No one asked why. He stopped less than 3 feet from me, his face controlled except for the disbelief in his eyes. "Where did you get that necklace?" he asked. My pulse hammered beneath the chain. I heard Grace's voice again, telling me that truth always demanded courage before it offered freedom. Adrian waited. The room waited with him. I closed my fingers around the silver bird and forced myself to meet his gaze. "From the woman your family forced to disappear," I said. For one suspended second, Adrian Moretti said nothing. The ballroom remained silent around us, but his expression changed so slightly that anyone else might have missed it. His jaw tightened. His right hand closed once at his side. Then the calm returned, colder and more precise than before. "Come with me," he said. It was not a request. I looked toward the exit instead. "I came here for the museum. I am leaving with the museum." His eyes dropped to the leather portfolio under my arm, then returned to the silver bird at my throat. "You just accused my family in front of 300 people. You are not walking into the street before I understand why." 2 security men stood near the ballroom doors, watching without appearing to watch. My heart pushed hard against my ribs, but I remembered the last promise I had made Grace. Never let powerful people convince you that fear was the same thing as obedience. 5 minutes, I said. The door stays open. Something unreadable moved through Adrian's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or surprise that I had placed conditions on him. He turned without answering, and I followed him into a private library beside the ballroom. Dark shelves covered the walls from floor to ceiling. The open doorway remained visible behind me. Adrian stopped near a walnut desk and held out his hand. "The necklace." I covered it with my palm. "No, I need to examine it. You can look from where you are." The silence between us sharpened. Men like Adrian probably heard yes before they finished speaking. After a moment, however, he lowered his hand. "Who gave it to you?" "Grace Parker." The name produced no reaction. "Your mother?" he asked. "The woman who raised me." His gaze narrowed. That was not my question. I swallowed. Grace had waited until 3 days before she died to tell me the truth. I could still remember the hospital light turning her skin pale, the paper cup trembling between her hands, and the way she looked at the necklace instead of me. Grace was not my biological mother, I said. She adopted me when I was a baby. The records were sealed, and she refused to tell me who arranged it. Adrian stepped closer but stopped before entering the space I had claimed around myself. Then why did you say my family forced her to disappear? Because those were her words. She said one man inside the Moretti family found her after the fire and gave her a choice. Leave New York under another name, or place the child in someone else's care. His composure cracked for less than a breath. What child? I hesitated. Once spoken, the sentence could never belong only to Grace and me again. She told me that if a Moretti recognized the bird, I had to say Vivian survived the fire. The color left Adrian's face. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone in the ballroom to notice. But I stood close enough to see the man behind the power lose his footing without moving an inch. Vivian was my mother, he said quietly. She died 19 years ago. Then Grace lied. No. His answer came too quickly. His eyes fixed on the necklace as though it had opened a door he had spent half his life holding shut. Before I could ask what he meant, a man in a navy suit appeared in the doorway holding a phone. Mr. Moretti, we have a security issue. Adrian did not look away from me. What kind? Someone accessed the guest registry through an inactive Foundation administrator account. They searched for Elena Parker, downloaded her home address, and erased the request. The room seemed to contract around my name. Adrian's voice became very still. Preserve the access logs and close the hotel exits. I stepped back. You said 5 minutes. And someone used 4 of them to find out where you live. He looked at the silver bird again, then at me. Someone knew you would wear that necklace tonight. Adrian gave the order before I could object. A black sedan would take us to his house along the Hudson River, where his security team could monitor every entrance. The word monitor sounded better than control, but not by much. No, I said. The man in the navy suit looked at me as though people rarely refused Adrian Moretti twice in one evening. Adrian only watched me. Your address has been compromised. That does not make your house my only choice. Tonight, it may be the safest one. The difference in his wording was small, but I noticed it. He was still trying to direct me. He was also trying not to take the decision completely out of my hands. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low enough that the ballroom guests could not hear us through the open library door. Then I have conditions. His eyebrows lifted slightly. My phone stays with me. No one searches my belongings. You do not decide where I go without explaining why. If you find anything about Grace, Vivian, or my adoption, you show it to me. All of it. The security man shifted his weight. Adrian remained still. I could almost see the argument taking place behind his eyes, instinct fighting restraint. Finally, he nodded. Agreed. The drive north lasted 40 minutes. Manhattan disappeared behind tinted glass, replaced by dark stretches of highway and the silver reflection of the river. Adrian sat across from me in the rear cabin, answering messages without speaking. He never asked for the necklace again. That should have made me feel safer. It did not. His home stood behind iron gates at the end of a winding road, less like a mansion than a stone fortress pretending to be one. Inside, the rooms were quiet, warm, and almost painfully orderly. No family photographs lined the entrance. No coats hung carelessly over chairs. It felt like a place designed for living without leaving evidence that anyone had lived there. A woman named Margaret showed me to a guest room on the 2nd floor. Adrian remained in the hallway. You are free to use the house, he said. The West Wing is private. That sounds less like freedom and more like a map of my cage. His expression tightened, but he did not answer. After midnight, sleep refused to come. I left the room and followed the faint light beneath a door at the end of the corridor. It opened into a study filled with filing cabinets, old newspapers, and photographs spread across a wide table. Adrian stood near the window with his jacket removed and his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. You said the West Wing was private, I said. This is the East Wing. The answer was so dry that I almost smiled. Almost. Then I saw the photograph nearest me. Adrian was 8 years old, standing beside Vivian on the steps of the same house. Behind them, half turned away from the camera, stood Grace. Younger, thinner, unmistakable. My breath caught. She worked here. Adrian came to my side, but did not touch the photograph. Apparently, you knew her. I knew everyone in this house by their first name. I do not remember hers. I picked up the photograph carefully. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cedar. One corner had been folded, as though someone had hidden it in a pocket. When I turned it over, 7 words were written in faded blue ink. Grace knows where the second child is. Adrian read them over my shoulder. The silence that followed felt heavier than any locked door. What second child? I whispered. His face had gone still again, but his eyes had not. That, he said, is what someone has spent 19 years making sure I never asked. We left the photograph on the table until dawn began turning the windows gray. Adrian called 3 people before sunrise. A retired housekeeper, a former family attorney, a priest whose name appeared twice in Vivian's old calendar. No one gave him a straight answer. Every pause sounded rehearsed. Every denial arrived too quickly. By 7 in the morning, the house had filled with quiet movement. Coffee appeared. Cars were prepared. Security checked the road beyond the gates. Adrian stood at the kitchen island reading a scanned church ledger while I watched steam rise from a cup I had not touched. St. Catherine's, he said. It is about 90 miles north. Grace attended that church. She sent money there for 17 years under a different last name. He turned the screen toward me. The donations stopped the month she died. A handwritten note had been attached to the final payment. Keep the children separate until the truth is safe. My throat tightened around the word children. You think I am the second child? Adrian did not answer immediately. That was becoming his most honest habit. I think someone wanted us to consider that possibility. That is not the same thing. No. His gaze moved to the necklace. It is not. We drove north beneath a low sky the color of unpolished silver. The Hudson followed us on the left, broad and cold, disappearing behind bare trees and returning around every bend. Adrian sat beside me this time instead of across from me. He kept several inches between us, as though remembering every boundary I had drawn. St. Catherine's stood beyond a small town of brick storefronts and white porches, its stone bell tower rising above a cemetery covered in autumn leaves. Father Michael Brennan met us inside. He was in his 70s, with careful eyes and hands that shook slightly when Adrian said Vivian's name. I wondered when one of you would come, he said. One of you. The phrase landed between us. Father Brennan led us downstairs to an archive room that smelled of paper, wax, and damp stone. He unlocked a metal cabinet and removed a narrow box tied with faded green ribbon. Inside were 2 registration cards dated the same night, 19 years earlier. The first listed Adrian Moretti, age 8, transferred temporarily under church protection. The second listed an unnamed infant girl. No father was recorded. The mother was Rachel Bennett. Guardian authorization had been signed by Vivian Moretti. I stared at the ink until the letters blurred. Was this baby me? Father Brennan looked at the silver bird around my neck. Grace believed so, but she wanted you to have more than belief. He handed me a sealed envelope yellowed at the edges. My name was written across the front in Grace's handwriting. Elena. Inside was a notarized copy of my original birth affidavit. It named Rachel Bennett and Thomas Bennett as my biological parents. The date, hospital, and infant identification number matched the sealed adoption summary Grace had kept in our apartment. Adrian read the document without touching it. You are not my sister, he said softly. No. The word should have brought relief. Instead, it opened another question. Why had Vivian risked everything to protect a child who was not part of her family? Father Brennan reached back into the box and removed a photograph. Vivian stood beside Grace, holding an infant wrapped in a white blanket. Behind them, on the church steps, Rachel Bennett looked directly into the camera. She had my eyes. On the back, Vivian had written 6 words. If I disappear, Rachel knows why. The photograph remained between us on the archive table while Father Brennan searched for anything else tied to Rachel Bennett. Adrian studied her face with the concentration of a man trying to remember a dream he had been taught to forget. My family said she betrayed my mother, he said. His voice was quiet, but the words carried the weight of something repeated for years. They said Rachel gave private records to our enemies. They said Vivian trusted the wrong woman, and that trust destroyed everything. I looked at the picture again. Rachel stood beside Vivian, not behind her and not beneath her. Their shoulders touched. They looked like women sharing a burden, not enemies. Grace never spoke about Rachel with shame, I said. She spoke about her like someone brave. Adrian turned toward the small window near the ceiling. Pale daylight crossed his face, revealing exhaustion beneath the control. then I may have spent 19 years believing a story designed for me. Father Brennan returned with a ledger, but it contained only dates, donation amounts, and initials. Nothing explained where Vivian went after the church or why Grace had hidden me in Brooklyn. We drove back toward the city afternoon. I kept the photograph and the letter inside my portfolio. Adrian made no attempt to take them. Halfway down the highway, my fingers found the silver bird again. The pendant felt warmer than usual. I pressed my thumbnail along one wing and felt a seam I had never noticed before. "Pull over," I said. Adrian glanced at me. "What happened?" "The necklace opens." The driver stopped at a quiet, scenic overlook above the river. I stepped into the cold air and worked the edge carefully. A small panel lifted with a soft click. There was no photograph inside, no folded message, only a thin brass strip stamped with letters, numbers, and an old museum accession symbol. I called Daniel Reed, the Brooklyn Museum archivist who had trained me to identify everything from 19th century canvas marks to obsolete storage labels. Daniel answered on the second ring. "Please tell me you are not calling about work on your day off. I need you to look at an accession code." I sent the image. He was silent for nearly a minute. "This belongs to the Moretti Foundation film collection." Adrian looked at my phone. Daniel continued. "The foundation donated its neglected motion picture archive to the museum 8 years ago. Most of it has never been cataloged. I managed the off-site inventory." The explanation made the metal strip suddenly feel heavier. "Can you trace it?" I asked. "Give me an hour." Adrian looked toward the river while we waited. If Rachel recorded something, she may have known written records could be altered, and she trusted Grace to keep the locator. "She trusted you," he corrected. Daniel called back 47 minutes later. The code identified a 16mm reel stored in the museum's Brooklyn warehouse. A request to destroy it had been filed 12 years earlier, before the foundation transferred the collection. The request had been rejected because it lacked the required second signature. "Who submitted it?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. "Victor Moretti." Adrian went completely still. Victor was his uncle, his advisor, and the man whose name appeared on nearly every foundation document after. Vivian disappeared. Daniel continued before either of us spoke. "The reel is still here. An inventory technician digitized one frame during the transfer." My phone chimed. The image took several seconds to load. It showed a room with faded wallpaper and a clock on the wall. Rachel stood near the camera. Beside her was Vivian Moretti. A newspaper visible in Rachel's hands had been published 6 months after the night Adrian was told his mother had died. Adrian stared at the image on my phone until the screen dimmed. He touched it once, bringing Vivian's face back into the light. "That room belonged to my father," he said. "He kept a private office in our old house in Connecticut." Daniel arranged for us to examine the surviving film that evening in the museum's preservation lab. By the time we reached Brooklyn, rain had begun tapping against the windows, soft but persistent. The museum was closed, and every footstep echoed through the empty halls. Daniel met us near the service entrance with a gray archival case held against his chest. He looked at Adrian, then at the 2 security men waiting outside. "This is the strangest favor Elena has ever asked me," he said. "She once made me identify paint from a restaurant wall at midnight." Adrian did not smile, but I saw the tension in his shoulders loosen by a fraction. Inside the lab, Daniel loaded the fragile reel into a preservation scanner that projected each frame onto a large monitor. Rachel appeared first. She sat at a wooden table with her hands folded, speaking silently because the separate audio track was missing. Vivian entered the frame and placed several folders beside her. She looked tired but unmistakably alive. Adrian stood so still that even his breathing seemed controlled. Then a man crossed the back of the room. We saw only his shoulder, his hand, and a heavy gold ring bearing the Moretti crest. Adrian stepped closer to the monitor. "That was my father's ring." His voice changed when he said it. Not colder, younger. "Charles wore it every day until he died." The next frames showed Vivian pointing toward the folders while Rachel held up the newspaper. Proof of life. Proof that everything Adrian had been told was false. The man returned, remaining just outside the camera's focus. His hand rested on Vivian's chair as though he owned the room and everyone inside it. "My father knew," Adrian said. "He helped hide her." I wanted to believe the evidence was that simple, but Grace had taught me to distrust answers that arrived too neatly. I moved beside Daniel, and studied the film leader beneath the inspection lamp. A handwritten label marked the recording date. The ink looked darker than the surrounding notes. Stop the scanner. Daniel froze the image. Beneath the newer date was a faint impression from the original writing. The month had been changed. So had the year. Someone altered the timestamp, I said. Adrian came closer. Why? To make it appear that your father was in that room after Vivian disappeared. Daniel scanned several frames at a higher resolution. The gold ring became clearer, but so did the wall behind the man. A narrow mirror hung beside the clock, catching part of the room the camera had missed. In its reflection stood another figure near the doorway, silver at his temples, one hand resting on a cane he had carried for most of Adrian's life. Adrian recognized him before I did. His face hardened, but his voice remained almost a whisper. Victor. The ring had been placed in the scene to implicate Charles. Victor had been watching the recording from the edge of the room. Then Daniel's computer sounded a quiet alert. He looked at the screen and went pale. The moment I opened the reel's restricted accession record, the system sent an automatic notice to a Legacy Foundation administrator account. Adrian turned toward him. Whose account? Daniel swallowed. Victor Moretti. My phone began to ring. Victor did not sound surprised that we had found the film. He sounded disappointed that we had found it without him. Miss Parker, he said, his voice smooth and patient. You have something that belongs to my family. I have information that belongs to yours. We should correct that imbalance. Adrian reached for my phone, but I stepped away. Where? I asked. Victor named a private reading room at the Moretti Foundation, 6 blocks from the hotel. Where this had begun. Midnight. No security. No Adrian. I agreed before Adrian could object. The moment the call ended, the room filled with his silence. You are not going alone, he said. I am not planning to. Claire Sullivan arrived 20 minutes later carrying a laptop and 2 recording devices. She had already delivered copies of the film, the church records, and the hotel access logs to a federal prosecutor. Investigators would remain nearby, but they needed Victor to confirm his role in suppressing the records. Daniel fitted a microphone inside the seam of my coat and placed a nearly invisible receiver behind my ear. Adrian listened from a car across the street, close enough to intervene, but far enough to keep Victor talking. Before I left, he looked at me as though every instinct in him was demanding control. What would make you feel safe, he asked. The question mattered more than he knew. Knowing you will let me finish, I said. Even if you hear something you hate. He nodded once. I will. Victor waited beneath a green reading lamp in a room lined with locked glass cases. His cane rested against the table. A leather folder sat beside it. The necklace, he said. First, tell me why you accessed the hotel registry. His smile barely moved. I needed to know whether Grace's child had brought the bird back into my house. Your house? I asked. The hotel belongs to Adrian. Everything Adrian controls exists because I taught him how to control it. I placed a copy of the film image on the table. Rachel found the hidden accounts. Victor looked at the photograph, but did not deny it. Rachel found numbers she was never qualified to understand. Then why did you order the reel destroyed? Because Vivian had become unpredictable. You made her disappear. His eyes sharpened. I placed her in a private treatment center until she agreed to surrender documents that could have destroyed the family. And Rachel helped her escape. Silence answered before he did. I pushed the church photograph toward him. You threatened Grace and forced her to leave New York with me. I gave Grace a choice that kept the child alive and the family protected. His own. Words settled between us. Confirmation. Not a speech. Not a confession offered freely. A truth pulled from his pride one piece at a time. Claire's voice sounded through the receiver. We have enough. Victor leaned forward. You came here for your mother. No. I came to make sure you could never erase her again. The doors opened. Adrian entered with Claire and 2 federal investigators behind him. He did not hurry. He did not look at his uncle. He looked at me, waiting for my choice. I stepped away from the table. One investigator secured the leather folder as evidence. Inside were Vivian's treatment records and a small cassette labeled in her handwriting. Victor had brought it because it was the only proof valuable enough to trade for the necklace. Claire found an archive player and inserted the cassette. Static filled the room. Then a woman's voice, older and tired, spoke one clear sentence. Adrian, if Elena has found this, tell her to come to Camden, Maine. Rachel left the rest with me. We left New York before sunrise and reached Camden early that afternoon, following a narrow road that curved between pine trees and gray water. The town looked like the kind of place people chose when they wanted the world to stop looking for them. White houses faced the harbor. Small boats moved against the wind. Nothing about it matched the Moretti name. Adrian sat beside me in silence, holding Vivian's cassette in both hands as though it might disappear if he loosened his grip. The address led us to a weathered cottage on a hill above the bay. A woman named Eleanor Shaw opened the door before we knocked. She was nearly 80, with silver hair and a blue wool sweater buttoned carefully to her throat. When she saw Adrian, her eyes filled with recognition. "You have your mother's expression," she said. Adrian did not answer. Eleanor stepped aside and let us in. The cottage smelled of cedar, tea, and old paper. Sunlight fell across shelves crowded with books and framed photographs. Vivian appeared in many of them. Older, smiling, alive during years Adrian had been taught she never reached. He stopped in front of one taken beside the harbor. Vivian stood with one hand resting on a cane and the other around Eleanor's shoulder. The photograph had been taken only 4 years earlier. "Where is she?" Adrian asked. Eleanor's face softened. "She died 2 winters ago. Peacefully. She left instructions in case you ever came." Adrian turned toward the window. He did not move for several seconds. I wanted to reach for him, but I remembered what he had given me in the Foundation archive. Space. Choice. So I waited. Eleanor led us upstairs to a small room overlooking the water. 3 boxes sat on a desk. One carried Adrian's name. One carried mine. The third was marked Rachel. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were letters, photographs, a hospital bracelet bearing my mother's name, and a copy of the birth affidavit I had seen at St. Catherine's. The first letter was written by Vivian. She explained that Rachel had discovered Victor's hidden accounts and helped her preserve the records. When Victor began watching them, Rachel placed me with Grace and deliberately drew his attention away from us. She died from an illness 3 years later, still believing I was safe. I pressed the paper against my chest. All my life, I had believed silence meant abandonment. Now I understood that silence had been the final shelter 3 women built around me. Adrian opened his box slowly. Vivian had written that leaving him was the greatest sorrow of her life, but remaining near him would have allowed Victor to use him as leverage. She had watched from a distance through trusted friends, waiting for the day the truth could reach him without placing him under Victor's control again. Adrian read the last page twice. Then he sat beside the window and closed his eyes. The most powerful man I had ever known looked suddenly like the 8-year-old boy from the photograph. "She knew who I became," he said. "She knew who you were forced to become," I answered. "That is not the same thing." His eyes opened. For once, there was no command in them, no calculation, only grief and a question he did not know how to ask. I crossed the room and held out my hand. He looked at it before placing his palm in mine. His grip was careful, almost uncertain. We sat that way while the harbor bells sounded below us. For the first time, his silence did not feel like power. It felt like permission. 8 months later, the Moretti name no longer meant the same thing to me. Adrian had made the Foundation's hidden records public, removed Victor from every position of influence, and turned the financial evidence over to federal investigators. Prosecutors had filed charges based on the accounts, false records, and years of concealed transactions. Newspapers called it a scandal. Business reporters called it a collapse. Adrian called it the first honest decision his family had made in 19 years. I called it proof that power could change direction. During the months after Maine, he never asked me to stay near him. He never appeared at my apartment without permission or sent security to follow me. He called. He listened. He showed up when I invited him, and when I needed space, he gave it without turning silence into punishment. Trust did not arrive like lightning. It accumulated through small choices until one day I realized I no longer expected him to take mine away. My exhibition opened on a cold Friday evening in Brooklyn. After months of legal review, restoration work, and permission from the women who had preserved the records, the museum gave the collection its largest temporary gallery. Daniel helped prepare every document inside it, although he still threatened to hide the keys whenever I rearranged a display after midnight. Along the walls hung photographs, letters, restored documents, and stories of women whose names had been removed from family histories. Rachel, Vivian, Grace. Not footnotes anymore. Not secrets kept in locked rooms. At the center of the gallery, beneath a simple glass case, rested the silver bird. I had cleaned the chain but left the tiny scratches across its wings. They belonged to every hand that had protected it before mine. The card beside it did not mention wealth, betrayal, or the Moretti name. It said only, 3 women carried the truth so 2 children could survive it. Visitors stood before those words longer than they stood before anything else. Some wiped their eyes. Some held the hands of the people beside them. I watched from across the room and understood that the necklace had finally become what Grace intended. Not a warning, a witness. Adrian arrived after the last guest had left. He came alone, wearing a dark coat with rain resting across the shoulders. Months earlier, men would have cleared the hallway before him. That night, he waited outside the gallery doors until I noticed him. "You are late," I said. I wanted the evening to belong to them. His gaze moved across the photographs and stopped at the glass case. "You are not wearing it." My hand rose automatically toward my throat, finding only skin. For years, the necklace had been the first thing I touched whenever I felt uncertain. I lowered my hand. I finally know who I am without it. Adrian looked at me then. Not at Rachel's daughter. Not at Grace's promise. Not at the woman connected to the darkest chapter of his family. Me. I spent most of my life believing that caring for someone meant keeping them close enough to control what happened, he said. You taught me that protection without choice is only another kind of cage. The gallery lights hummed softly above us. Rain traced silver lines down the windows. He remained near the doorway, leaving the distance between us untouched. I do not want the past to decide what happens next, he continued. But I would like a place in your life, if that is something you freely choose. The old Adrian would have crossed the room. He would have decided that silence meant yes. This man waited. So I walked toward him. I did not give him the necklace. I did not offer a promise written by someone else. I simply opened the gallery door wider and held out my hand. Come in, I said. His fingers closed around mine with the same careful uncertainty I had felt in Maine. Together, we stepped beneath the photographs of the women who had saved us. He had once ruled an entire city through fear. But the night he asked instead of commanded, he finally became a man worth following.